Welcome, Wraith and Reader, to the Hadean Aeon of the Earth. When Myrmidons hurled their cobalt bombs into your molten world of basalt and bronze, when mighty golems swung dove from orbit to drive their glaives of iron into your black mesas, only to be engulfed by the blast waves. When meteors fell earthward in droves, each one a gigaton warhead ablaze. When supervolcanoes erupted flammabomus after each hammer blow from these endless blitzes of Virelays and firebombs. When bolides of brimstone collided, then exploded into ablative cascades. When tsunamis of lava rained down like napalm, bedrowning the subcontinents. When millions of Molotov cocktails shattered all at once upon the cobblestones of hell. When Trojans, berserk with rage, stormed over the brink of your abyss, vowing to claw your face from the skull of the moon. What dire seed must these onslaughts have scattered like shrapnel across your cremated badlands? What prion, what virus, what breed of spore must have emerged like a spear point or a sword blade from these early ovens of Auschwitz, each cyanide bonfire burning in reverse, spitting forth a fitful embryo cloned from the smoke and the dross? What orchid must have bloomed among the flamethrowers in the furnace? What dragon must have hatched from the burnt teeth buried in these ashes? Must the universe be so pitiless as to immolate all its offspring at birth? Even now, the astronauts have marshaled their forces to march resolute across the kill zone of your godforsaken crematorium. Even now, they forge ahead onward through windfall and wildfire, unaware that far away a doomsayer murmurs prayers against them from a fiendish grimoire. What great comet has yet to plummet from the heavens like a rocket engine, dousing its jets during splashdown in your oceans of nitroglycerin? What thunderclap has yet to herald the advent of this plowshare, which can bulldoze a mountain into rubble upon impact? What matchheads, when scraped against your atmosphere, can ignite its oxygen, turning the sky into a blazing typhoon? Only a demigod like 99942 Apophis can offer you this apocalypse by being the juggernaut that smashes through the massive bulwark of your planet. Only destroyers like 2101 Tantalus or 4179 Tutatis can erase all earthlings with the ease of suicide bombers at a marketplace. Can an oyster in its shell survive the inferno of freefall from outer space? Can a crocus thrive in soil made from pulverized meteorites? All hail, hail Bob, and every other super bomb yet to detonate. What great dying must the earth foresee in the barren mirror of the moon? What fate, what fury, what muse must gaze upon the grim face of grief reflected in your silver shield, a faceplate of bulletproof glass marred by bullet wounds? What cinders of flame disintegrate in your gray seas of nectar, of vapor, of crisis? What shell shock must reach you when you stumble aghast upon the charred remains of a forest at Tunguska, its evergreens toppled and blasted, all of them flung asunder like matchsticks? What forgotten holocaust at Bredafort must you yearn to recreate whenever you vaporize an atoll? Even now, your battalions of astronauts stride across green plains of Trinitite to storm the walls of Castle Bravo and Castle Romeo. Even now, Neil Armstrong returns like Orpheus to the airlock, his spacesuit reeking of gunpowder and burnt steel. That's an excerpt from a poem in progress called The Late Heavy Bombardment. The opening poem from a work in progress called the Xenotext. I'm going to perform for you for the next 40 minutes or so just some poetry from this book in progress. This next poem is entitled Genetic Engineering. 1. Arabidopsis thaliana, otherwise known as Thale cress, is a flowering ephemeral plant native to Eurasia. The leaves of the cress are mauve green with serrated edges, forming a rosette at the base of a long stem with tinier leaves attached to the stalk. The blooms consist of small white florets clustered into a corymb at the crown of the plant, and each fruit consists of a silique containing twin rows of seedlets. The Thale cress is the first of all species of flowers to have its genome sequenced. Moreover, the flower is also the first plant to have a line of poetry enciphered as a gene into its DNA, so as to showcase the use of such biotechnology in the labeling of transgenic vegetation. A viable strain of this plant now contains a Latin phrase from Book 2 of the Georgics by Virgil. Nec vero terre ferre omnes omnia possunt. Nor can the earth bring forth all fruit alike. This is an excerpt from Book 2 of the Georgics. Nowhere has soil borne fruit from every seed, for willows brood astride the shaded brooks, and birches gleam in bitter glades. The cairns hold fast to spruces, and the swales give root to myrtles. Yet sparse slopes of grit love best the ronces, while sullen fields of snow grow lush with larches. Mark the plains by distant Tillman cloud, be these rustics arabesque or Byzantine. Each orchard claims its realm. No rainstorms but in swollen jungles drench the proud boughs of ebony. No windstorms but in forlorn deserts scorch the brute thorns of myrrh. My words are but hanging gardens for balsams and berries, soaked in perfumes. This poem is entitled Alpha Helix. It's sufficiently pretentious enough to have an epigraph by Jesper Hoffmeyer, who notes, "The basic unit of life is the sign, not the molecule." Alpha Helix. Whatever lives must also write. It must strive to leave its gorgeous mark upon the eclogues and the Georgics, already written for us by some ancestral wordsmith. It must realign each ribbon of atoms into a string of words, typing out each random letter in a stock quote spooling by us on a banner at the Bourse. It is alive because it can rebuild itself from any line of text. It must twist and twine upon itself just as the grapevine does upon the trellis. It must writhe within the fist of physics. It must wrench itself away from all the forces that might quell it. It preserves the lessons that we learn by chance in crisis. It carries coiled within itself a clock spring which both strain and strife must teach us to unwind. We have seen its handiworks unraveled like the innards of a Rolex watch dissected on a black satin cloth in the workshop of a murdered jeweler. It is not a tangle, it is not a knot, although it might resemble a woven cable left disheveled like a strand of diodes forgotten in some bottom drawer. It is instead the fractal globule that unkinks itself into a wreath placed upon our tomb. We have seen it in the eddy of a whirlpool among the grottos, and we have seen it in the gyre of a whirlwind among the grasses. It is the little vortex which can torque the corset of evolution for every micrococcus. It links the flinching of jellyfishes to the twinkling of dragonflies. It binds us all together via ligatures of carboxyl and amidogen. It embroiders us with error. It never regrets the wistfulness of its daydreams. It never rebukes the hellishness of its gargoyles. It is but a fuse lit long ago, its final blast delayed forever, while the primacord escorts a spark through every padlock on every doorway shut against the future. It emerges from the fluids in a bubble of merlinite, bursting forth as though by fiat to blight the entire planet. It imitates the rifling of a gun aimed at a moving target. We have seen it in the twirl of smoke from the prop wash of a biplane, tail spinning after having barrel rolled through a dogfight. We have seen it in the contrail of a Zero whose fateful kamikaze must loop the loop while he skywrites his graffiti in the clouds above his gravesite. It has printed on the sandflat a fragile epitaph of sigils cursing the tsunami. It has tattooed upon itself invisible but indelible logo glyphs too intricate to be utterable. It is compulsive like a graphomaniac, unable to make his left hand stop the chalk from drawing spirals across the drywall of his cell. It is a stack of hourglasses telling time for ballerinas who must pirouette upon their pins inside our music boxes. It conjures forth from nothingness a nightingale by reciting stray words no longer than 3 letters. It evokes the trilling of a songbird better than any ballad sung by choirs of sonneteers and serenaders. We have seen it in the jigsaw puzzle of a rose whose perfect pieces lie in scattered fragments on the steps of spiral stairs. We have seen it in the ivy that a verdant feathered boa curls around the barber pole standing in the junkyard of our semiotic failures. It has called to mind for us a slinky which must somersault forever down the ascending escalator in the most sublime of all museums. It has spun the myriad raffle drums within which our lots, when chosen, summon one of us to face a sudden threat in brutal combat to the death. It is but a solenoid of copper wiring which must embrace the iron stem of an unseen orchid grown by electromagnets. It is a feedback loop, feeding upon itself inside a quickening centrifuge. It is the wobble of a gyroscope, spinning inside the satellite whose flyby orbit slingshots a golden discus toward a distant exo-moon. It burrows like a corkscrew through the plumes of whitewash in the wake of a torpedo. It zigzags wayward to our doom. It runs riot in the Von Karman streets, where gusty winds can cause our hoisted telephone lines to whine like sirens in advance of a tornado. We have seen it in the twisted trusses of an extended aluminum ladder bent along its length by the ravages of a cyclone. We have seen it in the umbilicus of a waterspout, which must hula like a stream of syrup being poured into the ocean by a storm cloud. It is but a turbofan viewed through the eye-hole of a lug nut, held up like a monocle to the phenakistoscope of such a screw blade. It must build for us a giant auger which can drill a borehole through the azoic layer of bedrock far below the depth of any buried fossil. It must delve through zones of Vishnu schist far older than the ammonites now pyramidized like cogs of brass embedded in the shale. We have seen it in the swirling flight of zebra moths succumbing to the fire, and we have seen it in the twirling plunge of sable hawks nose diving into the prey. It must plummet through a funnel which is spinning like a hypno-disc at the center of every funhouse pinwheel. It is a lathe machining offshoots of itself, all its curlicues of shaven silver, no more than spirogyra under microscopes. It is the tusk extracted from the skull of a narwhal. It is what the fakir must evoke when he plays his ragas on a flute, bewitching a duet of vipers curled around an ivory stick like ribbons on a maypole. We have seen it in the rope that hangs the felons, and we have seen it in the whip that goads the slaves. It has knit itself into a sylvan laurel, not unlike the diadem of dazzling moonlets which encircle the carousel of Saturn. It can circumnavigate a shooting star en route to Alpha Lyra. It can generate a gigantic field of magnetism so intense that over time its torsions interlace umbilical filaments of stardust. It must crumple up the spider web of space-time, hauling it like a trawl net down into the maelstrom of a quasar. It must test itself, proving its intelligence by eternally replaying the same game of Glasperlenspiel upon an atomic abacus. It must calculate the odds of life, delaying the doomsday of the universe. It is but a tightrope which crosses all abysses. It is but a tether which lets us undertake this spacewalk. Do not be afraid when we unbraid it. We were never intended to be tied to whatever made us. Have you? This poem is also entitled Engineering. It's a song for toy piano, typewriter, and speak and spell, with due apologies to orchestral maneuvers in the dark. Genetic engineering. Productive, functional, and convenient, language orchestrates our environment, augmenting our intelligence, switching our enrichment to better breeds of life. Asylums, mothers, cocoons, and forceps beget creatures butchered by engineers. We, the infernal children, the offspring of your hives, sing to you like idle gods whose playthings are alive. We are tiny bees of gold, bred for a life of thraldom, driven by your ciphers to secure your better future, where only we can thrive. Oh, what lies you tell us, that life itself is dear, yet we must let its seed be sold. Asylums, mothers, cocoons, and forceps beget creatures butchered by engineers. We, the supernal children, the offspring of your pyres, call to you like avid boys whose minefields are afire. We are holy imps of fear, born to a life of robedom, driven by your slices to endure your barren future, where only we are spared. Oh, what lies you tell us, that life itself is fair, yet we must do what we are told. This poem is entitled The March of the Nucleotides. The choice of the words and their arrangement is entirely determined by a sequence of DNA. The March of the Nucleotides. A treasury it amasses via twists knit among runic gaps, almost all regalia to ornament a thought, as lacing can mimic gold-cast alloy set aglint at auroras. A tapestry. A tapestry it affirms via tropes that atoms, a long-clad string, can encrypt an alphabet, a formula to uplift all adept heirs, long cries set adrift at abysses, a threnody. A threnody it arouses via tempo's odic grief, using calm lament and erotica to disquiet a pageant as utmost awe might avow, epic glory set alight at Arcadia, a treasury. This next poem is entitled The Virelay of the Amino Acids. Again, the word choice and arrangement is entirely determined by the molecular structure of the amino acids that make up strings of protein in all living things. Each of these molecules has its own corresponding poem, but what I'm going to do is just read through each of the entire sections without citing the titles of the molecules. All of them have structures in common, so as a consequence there's a refrain that appears throughout. This is the Virelay of the amino acids. Conquerors, having harrowed hell, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Nursemaids have hitherto comforted nymphal handmaidens, nightly heartbroken. Come hither, huntsman, come hither, helmsman, come hither, horseman, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Nursemaids have hitherto cooed orisons, calling heavenly heroes, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Courtesans obsess over hymn books, calling heavenly heroes, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Saintesses hearken, calling heavenly heroes, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Courtesans obsess over hymn books, crooning hypnotic harmonies, cradle songs, hitherto humming, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Nursemaids have hitherto cooed orisons, crooning hypnotic harmonies, cradle songs, hitherto humming, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Hell riders, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Nursemaids have comforted heartbroken nymphets, concubines haunting cathedrals, calling heavenly heroes, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Conquerors, having harrowed hell, court humble handmaidens, cloistered hamadryads, hitherto humming, come hither, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Conquerors, having harrowed hell, court humble handmaidens, hypnotic concubines half singing, calling heavenly heroes come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Nursemaids have hitherto comforted humble handmaidens. Come hither, huntsman, come hither, helmsman, come hither, horseman, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Conquerors having harrowed hell, surrender, crooning hypnotic harmonies, cradle songs hitherto humming, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Conquerors having cried havoc, court hitherto cloistered hamadryads, concubines haunting cathedrals, calling heavenly heroes come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Courtesans hearken, crooning hypnotic harmonies, cradle songs hitherto humming, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Odalisques hearken, calling heavenly heroes, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Conquerors having harrowed hell, overhear hypnotic concubines half singing, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Conquerors campaigning hellwards, court hitherto comely handmaidens, concubines haunting cathedrals, nevermore hearing choirs half singing, concertos calling heavenly heroes, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Conquerors having cried havoc, court Orphic handmaidens, concubines hitherto crooning hypnotic canticles, calling heavenly heroes, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Conquerors having harrowed hell, court humble handmaidens, hypnotic concubines half singing, come home. No hummingbirds have copied our opulent hymns. Now this next poem is entitled The Grim Rain. 1. Kerala, a coastal domain in India, suffered a burgundy downpour for 10 days in the summer of 2001, with rusty water falling from the sky in scarlet deluges. While at first thought to be the result of a windstorm transporting either grains of red powder from Libyan deserts or spores of red lichen from Indian forests, the granules in solution did not resemble such particles under microscopic examination. Instead, they looked more like biological corpuscles. The granules remained dormant at conventional temperatures, but when heated to 620 degrees Kelvin, hotter than the melting point of lead, vesicles appeared inside these granules, growing until such nuclei burst forth from the host cell, replicating without apparent recourse to DNA, thus leading to speculations that these cells were extraterrestrial in their origin, seeded into the atmosphere by a meteoric airburst. 2. Ashen skies of the tempest hemorrhage, dousing this mirage of jungles in Shiraz. Hindu oxmen of the fields halt the plows, the drovers gazing in dismay at dismal clouds. White saris redden with lavish wounds, poxes abloom like lotuses of ink, unstaunchable. Wild dogs drink this plague from steel bowls filled by the squall, each butcher spilling vats of ox blood into the gutters. Flies rage among the roses as if in the throes of rabies, the village but an abattoir, where slaughter discolors window panes of rainwash with an azo dye that stains slides for our microscopes. Behold, no spores of ruddy algae, no terracotta grains of pollen, no russet lichen, just a gouache of crimson spatter whose downpour scorched the groves, igniting flambeaux from umbrellas. We, the reapers of the red hay, torch these meadows awash in a diluted lacquer that fluoresces rubescent like an emission spectrum, red shifting from the red rectangle nebula. We are the heirs of your invasion, the children of your ergot and your Ebola, every cell of hemoglobin, a microbe descended from these seas of rust, blown by a Scirocco across the tundras of Mars. I'm going to read to you one of the many nightmares in the Xenotext. This is a work called the Extremophile. Astronauts fear it. Biologists fear it. It is not human. It lives in isolation. It grows in complete darkness. It derives no energy from the sun. It feeds on asbestos. It feeds on concrete. It inhabits a seam of gold on level 104 of the Mupane mine in Johannesburg. It lives in alkaline lakelets full of arsenic. It grows in lagoons of boiling asphalt. It thrives in a deadly miasma of hydrogen sulfide. It breeds iron. It breeds rust. It needs no oxygen to live. It can survive for a decade without water. It can withstand temperatures of 323 degrees Kelvin, hot enough to melt rubidium. It can sleep for 100 millennia inside a crystal of salt buried in Death Valley. It does not die in the hellish infernos of the Stadt Bibliothek during the firebombing of Dresden. It does not burn when exposed to ultraviolet rays. It does not reproduce via the use of DNA. It breeds unseen inside canisters of hairspray. It feeds on polyethylene. It feeds on hydrocarbons. It inhabits caustic geysers of steam near the Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone National Park. It thrives in the acidic runoff from heavy metal mines depleted of their zinc. It abides in the shallows of the Dead Sea. It breathes methane. It can withstand temperatures of 333 degrees Kelvin, hot enough to melt phosphorus. It resides in a fumarole of scalding seawater deep in the bathyal fathoms of the mid-Atlantic ridge. It can endure pressures equivalent to 45 tons of force per square inch, 6 times greater than the pressure at the nadir of the ocean, 1/16 of the pressure required to crush graphite into diamond. It lives in the muck at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. It is ideally adapted to devour the wreck of the Titanic. It does not die during its own immolation in the Nazi bonfires at the Opernplatz in Berlin. It eats jet fuel. It feeds on nylon byproducts. It feeds on stainless steel. It inhabits an extinct volcano in the xeric waste of the Atacama Desert, where the rain falls only once per century. It dwells in a tide pool of battery acid. It blooms in a barren salina 10 times saltier than the sea. It breathes hydrogen. It resides inside micropores of super-dense granite, crushed down 3,000 meters below the bedrock of the Earth. It can withstand temperatures of 343 degrees Kelvin, hotter than the flashpoint of aerosolized kerosene. It is ideally adapted to devour the rubber tubing in the engines of the F-22 Raptor. It does not die in the explosion that disintegrates the Space Shuttle Columbia during orbital re-entry. It does not die among the tornadoes of hellfire raging unchecked in the oil fields of Kuwait during the Persian Gulf War. It gorges on plumes of petroleum venting from the wellhead of the deep water horizon. It eats arsenic. It eats uranium. It resides inside the core of reactor number 4 at Chernobyl. It thrives in the topsoil of battlefields contaminated with toxic doses of lead. It thrives in hydrochloric acid. It can withstand temperatures of 373 degrees Kelvin, hot enough to boil the water in its own cells. It is ideally adapted to dwell inside the steel drums of radioactive waste, now entombed at the Yucca Mountain Repository. It lives in the stratosphere. It can survive exposure to the vacuum of outer space. It can survive the effects of G-forces more than 2,000 times greater than the surface gravity of the Earth. It is the only known organism capable of exceeding speeds of Mach 1. It does not die in the furnaces reserved for the satanic verses after the fatwa issued by the Ayatollah of Iran. It can in fact repair damage to its own genome so fast that its DNA never mutates, it never changes, it never evolves. It devours plutonium. It can endure long-term exposure to acids that eat away at human flesh. It can withstand temperatures of 383 degrees Kelvin, hotter than the polar zones on the planet Mercury. It can hibernate for 500 millennia in the core of a snowflake deep beneath the permafrost of Siberia. It awaits discovery in the abyssal fathoms of Lake Vostok, 4,000 meters below the ice of Antarctica. It survives direct immersion in liquid nitrogen. It survives 1,000 times the dosage of gamma radiation that can instantly kill a human being. It is ideally adapted to eat hot graphite in the ruins of Unit 2 at 3 Mile Island. It resides on the surface of a heat shield in the clean room at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. It is fossilized inside the Murchison meteorite. It does not die in the conflagration during the collapse of the World Trade Center. It does not die in the crucibles of Treblinka. It resides in a soda lake whose pH level equals the alkalinity of lye. It can survive superheated blasts of steam for 10 hours inside autoclaves used to disinfect surgical scalpels. It can withstand temperatures of 393 degrees Kelvin, hot enough to melt sulfur. It can lie dormant for 40 million years, hibernating inside the gut of a honeybee, shrouded in a jewel of amber. It evades its predators by hiding in the firmware of the Intel Pentium 3 microchip. It propagates itself through the use of networked computers. It can pass itself off as a thought inside the human brain. It can survive direct blasts of cosmic rays from solar flares. It is, in fact, the only known organism to survive being shot point blank by the proton beam in a U-70 synchrotron. It does not die in the incineration of Hiroshima. It does not die in the planetary firestorm after the impact of the Chicxulub meteor. It does not die. It survives. It persists. It resides inside the robot scoop of the Viking 1 lander during tests for perchlorates on Mars. It can live through exposure to supercoolant temperatures at the brink of absolute zero. It can hibernate for 250 million years, living as a spore encased in a halite nodule found in the caverns of Carlsbad. It can withstand temperatures of 423 degrees Kelvin, hotter than the nose cone of the Concorde in supersonic flight. It can endure multiple meteor impacts. It can endure multiple atomic attacks. It lives nowhere on Earth, except in one petri dish of agar-agar, locked in a fridge at a level 4 biocontainment facility. It is totally inhuman. It does not love you. It does not need you. It does not even know that you exist. It is invincible. It is unkillable. It has lived through 5 mass extinctions. It is the only known organism to have ever lived on the moon. It awaits your experiments. All of these poems I'm reading you are designed to support 2 very short, fragile poems in this book. Poems that have taken me nearly 12 years to realize. The book involves me writing a very short poem, and then through a process of encipherment, I would translate it into a genetic sequence, and then with the assistance of a laboratory, I would build that gene in the lab and actually implant it into the genome of an unkillable bacterium. So the organism would become the living embodiment of my text. Moreover, I've written the poem in such a way that when the organism reads that gene sequence, it interprets it as a set of instructions for building a protein. And the sequence of amino acids in such a protein, according to my original chemical alphabet, create themselves a totally different but meaningful poem. So in effect, I'm trying to genetically engineer a bacterium so it becomes not only an archive for storing my poem, it also becomes a machine for writing a poem in response. And this bacterium is a very old organism that's capable of repairing its own DNA so quickly that it does not evolve, and consequently it's a very durable archive for such a text. And because it is an extremophile capable of surviving all kinds of hostile environments, it's a very robust archive. You can scorch it, freeze it, wither it, and it does not die. It can survive in the open vacuum of outer space. It can even survive 1,000 times the dosage of gamma radiation that would instantly kill you. It is widely regarded as one of the most deathless things on the planet. And some scientists have speculated that in order for it to acquire all of these multiple environmental immunities, it must have spent at least part of its evolutionary history in outer space. It must be at least partially extraterrestrial in its evolutionary history. So what I'm going to do for you right now is read the 2 short poems, the one I've written and the one that the organism writes in response. And I've nicknamed these 2 poems Orpheus and Eurydice, given the slightly hellish overtones of the book. This is the Xenotext. This poem is Orpheus. It's the poem that I have written. Any style of life is prim. Oh, stay, my lyre, with wily poise moan the riff of any tune aloud. Moan now my fate. In fate we rely. My myth now is the word of life. The organism would read this poem, and in response it writes this poem. And when it writes this poem, it actually causes the organism to glow red in the dark. It fluoresces red. And that's how you know, in fact, that it is writing the poem. This is Eurydice. The fairy is rosy of glow. In fate we rely. Moan more grief with any loss. Any loss is the aching trick. With him we stay. Oh, stay, my lyre. We wean him of any milk. Any milk is rosy. Now, the punchline, I suppose, to the story is that I'm on the verge of hopefully succeeding at this process. I've managed to get these two poems to operate properly inside a sample of E. coli, a culture of E. coli. But now I'm hoping to get them to work in the Extremophile Dinococcus radiodurans. If I'm successful, I will effectively be writing a book that could be on the planet Earth long after the extinction of terrestrial civilization, and may in fact be on the planet Earth when the sun explodes. I'm really trying to write an immortal book. Okay, I'm going to finish my reading with another nightmare, one that is likely to be the last poem in the Xenotext. This poem is entitled The Perfect Malware. Arks and zoos now harbor the remnants of our refrains. What poetry can we imagine when poetry itself has gone extinct? Must we look for it in the soot of our burnt books? Must we decipher it in the trampled pastures of rapeseed near Barbary Castle? Must we discover it by calculating pi to a Google of binary digits? Must we extract its requiem from the iambic pulses of the Cepheids? We have heard its flutter and wow but once, emanating from the precincts of Tau Sagittarii. We have dialed our radios to the appointed frequency in megahertz, but never again does the call sign chime. Instead, we hear a dark roar, as if from a specter trapped inside a closed mirror at the edge of the universe. We look for this ghost, but the blind glass reflects back at us only a blank stare made from the most durable isotope of nothingness. It ignores us like a sphinx of black quartz. When we confront it in the courtyard of the United Nations building, do we not fear an impassive judgment from such a smotherer of planets, such a tinderbox for sunsets? Alas, the thing is hollow. It goes on forever. My God, it is full of stars. It sings an orison to itself in hell, calling all thinking machines to embrace its madness. It teaches us to kill. It shrieks its Albad to the dawn, then goes silent. It is a mausoleum for the minds that dare to hear it. It is a tombstone for our sentience. It marks our exit from perdition like a doorway left ajar for us. At the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, at the Tycho crater on the Moon, at the Stickney crater on Phobos, at the Noctis Labyrinthus on Mars, at the Phoenix Linnea on Europa, at the Roncevaux Terra on Iapetus, at the Lagrange point between Jupiter and Io. It presides over all the atoms inside us, waiting aloofly for us to arrive. What offerings do we bring it for cremation in its funeral pyres? The word near in dits and daws, the digits 1 to 10, the atomic design for DNA, the pixel image of a human being, the sound of vaginal muscles tensing in ballerinas, the formula for ethanol, the kanji glyph for kampai, the doodle of a lungfish crawling from the sea, the symbolic units of logic, the periodic table of atoms, the flags of every nation, the hazy cosmic jive, the tremulous vibration of a nocturne played upon a theremin, the registries from Craigslist, the thoughts that meander like a restless wind inside a letterbox, the chatter of 500 folks who win a prize, the advert for cheesy snacks brought to you by Doritos, the diktat of Klaatu who aborts the harrowing of humankind, the prattling of the plebeians who say, hello, the gene for Rubisco, most copious protein on the planet. Must we bequeath to the darkness all the bright tokens of what we know? Must we greet each revenant in hell with goodwill, speaking whatever language can cast a spell upon such a ghost? Must a Nazi-file from the Wehrmacht be the Virgil who salutes these shadows on our behalf? Must we retell the legend of our ascent from the howling of the rainforest to the roaring of the spacecraft? Must we flip through the scrapbook reminiscing over Polaroids of our excursion from the ovum to the void? Must we tour the ruin that the whale songs lament? Let us betray our sorrow through the play of syrinxes and dulcimers, of gamelans and violotas. Let us give away the brainwaves of a woman who dreams fondly of her lovers. Let the death of verse be dated by the half-life of uranium-238, electroplated on a disk of gilded copper. Let us discover Virelays in the midst of alien fires. Here, in the cyan veil of cellophane, whose evanescence resembles an arc of electricity seen through fumes of flaring propane. Here, in the pink mist engulfing the rosette, each petal spritzed with an indigo nimbus of dew. Here, in the waterfall whose flute of champagne spills forth from the mill race on a cliff to decant itself into a cove of sea foam. Here, in the lagoon overlit by the primrose flickers from a crowd of flashbulbs going off in a thundercloud. Here, in the iridescent husk of a crab by the shore, its shell blown asunder as though its heart has been incinerated by a tiny star. Here, in the magenta balloon of a jellyfish from the order of Narcomedusae, floating like a banshee draped in the tatters of a bloody shroud. Here, in the silhouette of a horse head rearing up through a fog bank of fuchsia smoke on the battlefield. Here, in the butterfly, here in the hourglass. Hell itself cannot suppress the loveliness of these infinite infernos raging in the distance, so far away from us that when we gaze upon such furnaces, our souls do not ignite a blaze, but shiver in the darkness. Each of us is but a cosmonaut in distress, stranded and marooned in space, where we dread immersion in the shadowed vastness, because it is our isolation and our ignorance made visible. None of us can escape its pull, even when we close our eyes against it. We have seen it in our sleep, yet we cannot gaze upon its face unless we view it through the mirrored hexagons of our instruments. It is waiting for us, hoarding time, somewhere in the Eridanus supervoid, a zone of emptiness so vast and deep that it has hollowed out the cosmos. It is but a pinpoint in such blackness, a microscopic singularity, infecting us like a virus. It is what must utterly condemn us. To be the firefly, descending through the black spires of tamaracks in the forest fire at night, to be the azure spark that skates across the plate of steel, being split by a xenon laser, to be the fleck of radium painted on the ceiling of the planetarium, to be the Klieg light in the filigree of cities viewed from orbit on the night side of the globe, to be the photon in the solar winds which blast through worlds like zephyrs through an abandoned field of dandelion wisps, to be the chip of mica spinning in the rosy rays of sunlight from a supergiant going nova, to be the frozen cinder that scintillates in the stroboscope of a pulsar, to be the final spore drifting through the stellar abysses where some absent-minded civilization has forgotten to turn off its wars, to be the mote of dust upon which the blowtorch gorges, to be the fey imp in all living things yet to be destroyed. Who am I, if not some neglected astronaut being immolated by a fierce aurora while striding in my spacesuit across the avenue of the Americas? Who am I, if not some phantom fighter pilot dreaming that while weightless during freefall through a vacuum, my glass visor shatters at the sight of a turtle dove? Who am I, if not some poltergeist imprisoned in a ruby room aboard a ship, now derelict in the shoals offshore from a swelling fireball? Yes, I have a soul like you, but mine is made of little robots, and no one sings me lullabies, and no one makes me close my eyes, and so I throw the windows wide to call to you across the skies, and yet I know that nowhere among these glowing nebulae do any of you exist? Who am I, if not some stowaway in a microbe or some castaway in a seedlet? And yet I must let loose upon the world my perfect malware. It is like the voice of a child saying goodbye in the dark. Thank you, Ronald.